Well, thank you, Mohan and Andrew, for your generous introduction and for putting this conference together and for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's great to be a part of this panel because, indeed, I think this topic is one of the topics that are most important in new business development and that people have naturally a very great interest in. And so we're very pleased and happy to have an outstanding panel here this afternoon to help us with that. We have here on the first side, we have Scott Sandel here from New Enterprise Associates, and we have then Tom Kelly, who is a long-time executive recruiter in the Valley here, and we have Gordon Steele, an entrepreneur, currently chairman of Codaware, and Russ Siegelman, a general partner at Kleiner Perkins, but with also a very distinguished career at Microsoft. I know a little bit about him because I sometimes talk about him when I do a case on Microsoft, for better or worse. What I thought as we move, what I would ask you to do is maybe for each of the panel members to say a few words about what they consider to be sort of the most important thing that they want you to know about their background, rather than me trying to do that. So why don't I, for a moment, invite each of you to say a few words, and then I'll like to just introduce a little more and get to the action here.
Okay, great. I'm Scott Sandel, as Professor Bergelman indicated, and I think the two things that are important to know that you won't get from reading about my biography is that I met my wife here at Stanford, just up walking down from Tresser. We were classmates in the MBA class of 1992. And then the other thing is that I was lucky enough to go from there, both over the summer and afterwards, to work with Russ Siegelman at Microsoft.
I'm Tom Kelly, and probably the most significant thing is I just concluded 33 years of search work where the emphasis was the entrepreneur. I went 30 years to the same room, really, at 3000 Sand Hill Road, and the whole thing was putting together management teams. Before that, I had never been inside an executive search firm and had never even had a meeting with one. So.
Good afternoon. My name's Gordon Steele. I've taken, I guess I work now with 3 or 4 startup companies where I was in the first among 3 employees. I was able to take 3 of those public.
And I'm Russell Siegelman, and you already know a lot about me, apparently. I was at Microsoft for 7 years, started MSN, their online service. Before that, worked for Gates for about a year, which led to the start of MSN. And I've been now here in the Valley for about 8 years, working at Kleiner Perkins, investing in startups, high-tech startups.
Great, thank you. Before we get going, I would like to mention that this topic is actually important here at Stanford. And I would say not just, even though that would be enough, but not just from the perspective of teaching entrepreneurship, but also to do research on entrepreneurship. And as you know, we have a Center for Entrepreneurial Studies, and that is flowering, I should say. That's really developing. And one of my younger colleagues here at Stanford, some of you may know him, by the name of Martin Rueff, has actually just published a paper in the American Sociological Review, which is one of the top 2 journals in the world in sociology, that in fact examines, its paper is called The Structure of Founding Teams, that examines actually several mechanisms that could determine the founding team composition. I'll just mention one or a couple of them just to get you going. One of them is actually to what extent does the founder look for people that are alike, that he or she can trust? To what extent do they look for people with very strong functional skills in certain areas? To what extent do they look for people who already have high status in kind of the environment and try to attract them? To what extent are they limited by network constraints, that is the access that they have to various sorts of people? And one of his findings, actually, which I thought was interesting, perhaps as kind of leading into our discussion this afternoon, one of his findings, which was, as I said, published in one of the leading journals in sociology in the world, is that actually in the early stage, not surprisingly perhaps, but interesting to realize, founders are actually more concerned with trust and familiarity than, for instance, with functional competence per se. And so I thought that might be interesting to get the panel going on the question, what is the composition of a good management team? In other words, what are the essential qualities that characterize a well-rounded management team? And perhaps, Russ, you could kick it off, and we can invite our other speakers to jump in as they see fit. And we're also happy, I think that's okay, with our panel members here, that if someone has a really pregnant question to ask, raise your hand, and we will try to weave that part of it in the discussion as well. And I'll just use my role as moderator to make sure we keep moving forward. So how's that? Russ, please, sir.
Okay, I'll kick off. So it's a tough question because the composition of a good management team depends on, I think, the business plan you're pursuing. It depends on, to some degree, what the key milestones are. In other words, if you have a long development cycle, you probably don't need a great selling person early on. So it's a really hard question to pin down, but I'm being asked to pin down, so I'll give you some generalities. And of course, have to always fit them to specifics in the real world. But I think generally, what you need in a well-rounded, good management team early in one of these high-tech enterprises, which is the kind of businesses we invest in, I think you need 2 functional skills and 1 ingredient. I think the 2 functional skills you need the technology person, the person who understands the technology problem at a deep level, okay? And the other person you need is, I think you need the customer advocate, the person who understands the customer problem at a deep level. I mean, what is the real economic driving force that's going to create the value in the customer's mind? If you have those 2 things, you have the nucleus. I mean, you have to fill that over time. But if you don't have those 2 things from the beginning, it's always hard to recover, in my experience. So those are sort of the 2 functional skills I think you need right off the bat. And I think the ingredient that you need is, it's very hard to capture. I don't think it's just trust. I mean, trust is part of it. But the analogy I'll use is synchronized swimming. Okay, when you see synchronized swimming, it's almost like harmony. And all these people are twisting at the same time, and their arms are going in exactly the same direction. And it requires a lot of familiarity and trust, and probably a lot of practice. But yet everybody's sort of moving themselves. I mean, there's no communication while they're in the water together. And that kind of flavor is what the really high-performance early-stage teams have. They're kind of doing their own thing, but they're all synchronized at the same exact motion and direction. And I don't know how exactly it works, but when it works, it's a beautiful thing.
Great. Maybe some of the other panel members want to comment on that?
You want to go down, sir?
I think it's a strong advantage to go first. You've certainly hit the high points in my mind. I think the critical issue, from my perspective, is that if you want to be a very, very successful startup company, that you have to rely heavily on intellectual property. And by doing that, in order to do that, it's absolutely essential that you have 2 pivotal ingredients at the outset. I use slightly different terms, but I think they're identical to yours. One is the technical visionary or technical visionaries. And the other, which may in fact be in the same person, often it's not, is someone who is the marketing visionary, someone who really understands how that technology can be deployed in an effective way. If I had to then boil it down to a few more specifics, I'd say you need absolute commitment. You need a commitment not only to the success of the company, but also to the culture of the company. Having the appropriate culture, I believe, is absolutely essential. It doesn't have to be the same as any other company, but it does have to have a specific company focus, and certainly a part of that is integrity in dealing with others. Personally, I think you also need to be an optimist. I think you have to have a strong feeling that things are going to turn out right, or otherwise you might not get into this. I think you have to have a very, very understanding spouse. That's very important. A commitment to live somewhat of a balanced life. And finally, especially in the early stages, I think you need to have an unwavering commitment to downplay challenges raised by outsiders. In other words, the people who will tell you, you really cannot do this. Very, very quick anecdote. When I joined Xilinx, I had no idea what their product was. I talked to the CEO, and he said, it's a field programmable gate array. I said, I'd never heard of it. I had no idea what it was. And I thought, well, I'll talk to some analysts in order to get an opinion of this. I talked to 3 semiconductor analysts and 1 venture capitalist. I was surprised that I got 4 uniform feedback. It was, It's great for an early stage company for a prototype, but it will never get to volume. So could you be successful? Perhaps, but you'll never get beyond being a low volume prototype company. So I digested that for a week or two and went back to the chairman and said, I've looked at this, I've talked to some outside experts, and I'm a little concerned that perhaps this just will never get the scale that I hoped it would. And here's why. And he said, they're absolutely right relative to where we are today. But the technology that is being developed, not only in our architecture and design, but perhaps even more importantly in Moore's Law and semiconductor manufacture, will change those features 1,000-fold within 5 to 10 years. He turned out to be right. I'm delighted I joined.
Thanks. Tom, I think you wanted to.
It's nice that you have two venture capitalists, one real entrepreneur, and a headhunter, because what you're going to get is probably not universal truth, but personal truth. Based on my experience doing this is what worked for me. I always viewed the team as 5 or 6 players. There was the development of the product and the person who led that, the producing of the product and the person who led that, the sales and marketing of the product, sometimes combined, usually not, and the sort of keeping score and getting money aspect, and a CEO. And I usually encourage groups that I was working with to get as many of those people in place as soon as possible, because the important strategic decisions in all of those areas are made early on. The positioning of the product in the marketplace, the capital structure, how you're going to do your financing. So to have very junior level people or even venture capitalists making that decision for you is maybe not optimum if you're the entrepreneur. The two things I thought were most important in the individuals was IQ and motivation. Just raw intelligence and motivation in each of those slots. And one without the other doesn't work. Very smart, not motivated, not much happens. It's a real problem because IQ is sort of inherited, right? But motivation is learned. I mean, it's based on your situation growing up, usually. But you can be super smart, not motivated, not much happens. Super motivated, not too bright, and you run through walls, but they're the wrong walls, and you keep doing it over and over again. So to find that combination in two people in one person is key. It's the reason not all Stanford MBAs get to be CEOs, right? Very smart. Some of them maybe not as motivated. So.
I think all the comments everyone's made are on the money, and the one thing that I would add is the importance of a diversity, complementary skill sets, and actually diversity of backgrounds. And I think there's a couple reasons why this is important. But every startup is unique and faces unique challenges. And if you bring people together who all come out of the same background, maybe out of the same company, in the same industry, and they go off to tackle some new problem, they're often likely to fall into the trap where they just think it looks like the one they just did. And they try to do all the same things over again, which is often not the right thing to do. And so what I find to be really helpful is to have a couple members of the team. Bear in mind, it's very important to have people who understand the domain that they're in, both from a technology and markets standpoint, as the first two guys pointed out. But I think it's really important to have a couple people who aren't from that domain and who will sort of stir up the thinking a little bit. One place I found this to be true recently was in the storage industry, which started to get interesting about 5 years ago. The problem was it hadn't been interesting for about 10 years before that. So there were some talented people in the storage industry, but not that many. And so if you were just going to go out, if you hired a really great recruiter and said, go get the guys out of these talented storage companies, you'd have a pretty short list. And moreover, they wouldn't have seen anything change in 10 years, so they might repeat the same mistakes. So we were faced with this challenge because we invested in a couple of companies in this area. And at first it looked like a really daunting thing because we said, whoops, we invest in these companies and forgot to notice that there weren't a whole lot of people we could go recruit that were really talented. And then it sort of dawned on us that this could be an advantage if we started to mix these teams together, where we'd get some people who had the domain expertise, and then we'd bring in some people who maybe came from a different industry. So, for example, in that case, we looked around and we said, you know what? The networking industry has been really hot for about 10 years. A lot of the great people have been in the networking industry. Why don't we get some of those people to come over, and join these teams? And that turned out to be a really good thing to do. I was going to give you one little anecdote of a team that I got to see in action that I think is probably the most superlative team, just start to finish of any company I've ever seen. It's a company called Neoterras, which is now part of Juniper Networks through its acquisition by NetScreen a few months ago. And the interesting thing to me is these guys, to characterize them, they were all really top-notch guys in terms of IQ and motivation. All of them were doing their jobs for the first time. The CEO was a first-time CEO. VP of Marketing had been director but not VP. So they were all really motivated, up-and-coming sort of guys. But one of the really critical decisions, and they had some people from their industry, the technology guy was a real security expert and so forth, but not everybody was from that industry. The marketing guy was from Cisco, and he knew this product line really well, but the sales guy was from Excite and didn't know anything about it. And what was really interesting was that they had to face this decision about how they were going to sell their product. And everybody on the team had been in companies where the only way they knew how to sell a product was direct sales. And yet, because of their diversity of background, they were able to sort of step back and say, okay, is that really the right way to sell this product? And it turned out that they concluded it wasn't the right way. They talked to the board members about it. We suggested, maybe indirect channels because the price of this product is too low to support a direct sales force. So then they went away and studied a bunch of companies that had been really successful with indirect channels, including the one that they were going to use. Ironically, one of the companies they studied was NetScreen that ultimately became the acquirer of this company. But the impressive thing to me was, they were able to do something different than any of them had been able to do before, and they never missed a beat from the moment, they started down that path, because they worked like that synchronized swimming team that Russ was describing, where, they just anticipated issues before they happened and worked together really well. It's a beautiful thing to see.
Great, thank you. Any burning questions here? Yeah. Please make sure you stand up so that the others can hear what you answer.
Sure. My name is Omar Baig. I'm an entrepreneur, and that was an excellent example you gave. I was just wondering if the other panelists could also pick one team that they thought was an ideal one in a startup we might have heard of, and then explain why.
You might be better positioned than I, but not I.
But I'm not prepared. I'll talk about a team that it's not, the story's not written, so I don't know for sure that it's going to be super successful, but it's a team where the idea came from one person and was sort of implemented by a few. And the thing that's interesting about it is that when it first started, you could not find a single person, as part of due diligence, I called a lot of them, who said that it would work. It was just one person's idea that kind of came to fruition after many years of work and a lot of money and a lot of time. That's a company called Wild Blue Communications that's going to launch their first satellite next quarter to do broadband access to homes through a satellite. But what's interesting, I think, about that company is that there was just a very, very dedicated crew of about 5 people that just, it was a dream that they would not let die, and they just kept plowing ahead no matter what. So, in that case, they didn't have the skills. I mean, none of them were, one guy was from the satellite business later on, but the guy whose idea came from the cable industry. So, I don't know if that's a perfect example, but that's one example where that team persevered under just tremendous uncertainty and a lot of outsiders saying, no way will it work.
But they met the criteria that you had laid out in terms of having these 2 roles and
they had a
synchronized swimming.
They had a very good technologist who understood how to make it work, and there wasn't one person who understood the customer problem, because the customer problem there was pretty obvious. I mean, broadband access, but I think what they did understand was they understood the economics of the problem at a very deep level. Because this was the whole thing where you had to invest hundreds of millions of dollars before the thing could actually be in business. And so you really had to understand not only today's economics, but the economics 3-5 years out, and they understood that.
Right.
Yeah.
Other example, or should we move on?
I'll give one.
Yeah. Tom, maybe one more, yeah. Go ahead.
Kleiner Perkins was actually founded down the hall from me, and they had a real problem getting deal flow initially. New kids on the block, no one was sending them resumes or business plans, and they decided to incubate the company. And Tom Perkins brought in Jim Trybig, who had worked for him at Hewlett-Packard, and they founded Tandem, really from kind of within. Jack Luceno was a finance guy at HP. He was brought in as VP of Finance. But the thing that struck me that they did well, and this is kind of what I alluded to a while ago, was they built the team from the top down instead of sort of the middle up, saying you don't really need a VP of Finance now. You get by with an accountant. You don't really need a VP of Sales now or marketing. They got people. They hired their VP of Marketing, their VP of Finance, their CEO, all people that they thought they were hiring for the long run. And I think that's, and it worked. Usually it doesn't work that way. What usually happens is some of the people, or most of the founding situations I've seen, the founders don't last, right? Basically, or at least don't last in their position. And it has to do, I think, more with the starting point and sort of how you look at the management team going in. If you try to build a management team from the middle up, you usually have to redo it later when the company goes to market.
Yeah, that's a very interesting introduction, if you want, to kind of the second question that we wanted to address here, right? Which is kind of, and in some ways maybe it's a vicious circle, but it doesn't maybe have to be a vicious circle, because if you want to attract all the best people that you could possibly get, you may already have had some signal that there is support on the part of the VCs, that they actually are going to be willing to support it. But yet maybe if you don't have the people who are really outstanding already before you go to the VCs, then the VCs will not be willing to invest. So I don't know how, Scott, is this a false vicious circle, or how do you think about it as from the venture capital point of view? Sort of when do you actually do the things that Tom was actually saying you should be doing from day one, or do you actually try to do the best you can and wait until the VCs come in and actually provide you with some signals to the rest of the world that, hey, yeah, you should join this team?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really hard question, and I've seen lots of different approaches, not nearly as many as Tom and some of the other panelists, and it's one that I ask myself and I think about a lot, and I'm always looking for better ways to find the right path. I'm going to give you a couple of ideas, things that have been tried. One, I'll give you one example that seems to be succeeding, but it's very, very hard to figure out the right answer. I think the thing that is really important, no matter what path you take, either hiring the tandem model with the top-down, really proven guys, or any other model that you might think of, is to hire really, keep the bar extremely high with all the people that you hire in terms of IQ and motivation. And the reason is, it's the adage that A players hire A players and B players hire C players. But that's true not just from the standpoint of what people go out to hire, but also the kind of people they can attract. So if you get really, really good people in the company, they tend to attract really, really good people. Now the challenge is, when you're just starting out as an entrepreneur, it's first of all, it's hard to hire, hard to attract somebody who's really, really outstanding and capable of taking your company really far down the path. Oftentimes those people are not willing to take the risk to jump in really, really early. Occasionally it happens, but oftentimes it doesn't happen. And so you're stuck with this quandary, should I hire somebody who can only take it a little bit down the path, or, what's the right skill set to hire? And one of the things that you pretty quickly figure out is that the skill set really early on that you need is different than the skill set you need later on, which is one of the reasons it's really hard to have the same person go from start to finish. I did an experiment a couple of years ago with a company that we started in our office called Data Domain, and we had an entrepreneur, a guy named Kai Lee, who was a professor at Princeton on sabbatical out here, and he had an idea that we thought was really interesting in the disk-based backup area. Some very good technology, which gave him sort of an unfair advantage to start with. And we decided that instead of trying to hire a CEO right away, we were going to try to wait as long as possible to hire the full-time CEO, because we wanted to get somebody who was really experienced. We didn't figure we could attract him early on. And so the way we tried to do this was we brought in Greylock as a partner, and one of their partners, Anil Bhusri, was willing to be the acting CEO of the company. And so we, one day a week or something, and the company stayed in his office, and he was the acting CEO for about 18 months. And it turned out to work really well because we got the product out the door, and it was a really compelling product, and that was what it took to attract a really top-notch guy to come in as the CEO. And so we ended up getting a good guy from that standpoint. But I think some other elements of that were also critical. Kai was not out of the storage space. He was a computer architect by academic background. And so we got a guy named Hugo Patterson, who had been one of the key early guys at Network Appliance, and brought him in as a chief architect. So he had a lot of experience, and we didn't make a lot of mistakes that reinvent the wheel and so forth. And we also had this concept that Russ pointed out. We had somebody who was a customer advocate. Brian Biles was his name. He was the VP of Product Management, and he'd taken lots of products to market before, and that turned out to be really critically successful because he was able to go back to the development team and say, guys, these features matter and these ones don't matter. And then we hired another guy as VP of Engineering, Varun Mehta, who was really quite outstanding, and he came out of the storage space. So I won't belabor the point, but it was an interesting approach compared to the other approaches that you could take of trying to find the right guy right out of the gate. It's too early to say whether that was the right thing, but it seems to be going okay.
All right, Greg?
Well, I'll say one thing on this topic. Which I don't think it's a vicious circle at all. I think it's kind of a false conundrum to say, because I think there are two different roles, and the roles are quite different, and people confuse them. One is the founder or the entrepreneur, call it entrepreneur, and the second is the CEO. And sometimes you start with two people in those roles, but you don't often need a CEO at the beginning. What you need is the entrepreneur. And later on, you need the CEO. It's good to keep the entrepreneur in the company for cultural reasons, and usually that person is a high IQ, understands the background, but his or her role just naturally de-emphasized because the skill sets and the composition of those people are quite different. The entrepreneur, it's all about commitment, selling, passion, ability to convince people that their idea, his or her idea, is worth joining. That's it's fundamentally a selling job. That's what entrepreneurs do. They marshal resources from nothing. They convince people that have no right, in their right mind would do anything to join a company. They convince them to join, etc. CEOs, particularly professional people who've been general managers and CEOs before, that's not their job. Their job is to manage larger organizations, divisionalize, partition, all that kind of stuff that you have to do when you get bigger. And by the way, of course, entrepreneurs typically are not good at that. Now, of course, there's a few people, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, you can name a few people who've gone through both those phases, but it's not very often. That's one in a million. And I would argue, I knew Bill Gates quite well. I saw him manage very well over many years, but I think the role he's in right now, which is not the CEO job, is probably the most natural role for him. He did fine as the CEO for a long time, but probably what he's doing now is both best for Microsoft and best for him. So all I'm saying is, when we view an opportunity, we want to make sure there's an entrepreneur from the beginning. It's very hard. Sometimes we incubate companies, like you mentioned, Trabic and so forth. Yeah, occasionally we'll start right off the bat with a CEO because the idea is big enough or it's got enough momentum. But really, you need an entrepreneur from the beginning, and then later on, you need a CEO.
I just have to disagree. I believe there are entrepreneurial CEOs, and I think they exist all over the place, and that isn't a tough job. There's another factor here that at the risk of being thrown out of the room, there's sort of a built-in conflict, a built-in tension between founders and VCs. It's not, it's a natural tension. Sometimes it creates good things, sometimes it creates bad things, but it absolutely is there. And I can say in 33 years, I never saw a situation where it wasn't there, in some degree or another. And that tension is based on what their objectives are. The objectives of the founders are usually to build a Hewlett-Packard, an Intel, over many, many years, put the nuts and bolts together to build a big company. Dave Packard used to make a speech at venture capital conferences that said if we'd had VCs, they owned 51% of the company up until it was $1 billion. If they'd had VCs, they wouldn't have made it because it took them 10 years to learn their job. So there's the venture capitalists, on the other hand, have a liquidity date. Their objective out of the gate is the liquidity date. Whether it's selling the company, whether it's taking the company public to get liquid. So that's a shorter term goal than the people building an Intel or an HP. And what that leads to is sort of this tension which results in conflicts over control and influence. Okay, so if a young team came to me and they were thinking about venture capitalists to go to, my advice to them is to get as many of those people, including your CEO, in place before going. Because basically, if you don't recruit those people yourself, or at least have them, it'll get done for you. And basically that can work, but doesn't usually.
Can I respond just quickly? I have to disagree with all due respect. I mean, I can't say that other venture capitalists, but I can say at my firm, we have the 180 degrees different opposite view. I mean, we are not interested in short-term companies or short-term investments. In fact, we have partners on the board of Sun and Amazon and company Intuit, companies that have been around, 15 years, and we distributed our stock many years ago. And the reason? Because these are companies we born. We were there from the beginning. We have deep relationships with these founders and CEOs, and we have them over long periods of time. There's no company we invest in that we don't anticipate to be on the board of for at least 5 to 7 years. And I guess when I sit down across the table with an entrepreneur, and I know all my partners have this view, and say we want to invest in your company, we want to back you, that is not a short-term objective at all. And I think there's always natural tensions, if you will, between people who are investors and people who are not investors. But in my view, entrepreneurs should be thought of as investors. In fact, that's why we give them a lot of stock. That's why they have large positions, and we never take control positions in our companies, never, ever. So, I mean, I take the point in theory, but in practice, it never comes to pass in companies that we invest in.
Well, 5 to 7 years isn't long term. HP was created in 1939.
Well, but
that's relatively short.
We've been on the board of Sun for more than 10 years. Not every company lives 15 years.
Yeah, I would disagree somewhat. I mean, I think there are clearly tensions.
Tom, I'm on your side, though.
But
you'll have the final word.
I think, first of all, I think you have to look at the economics of what makes a venture capital fund successful. What makes a venture capital fund successful are some really big outcomes. And those don't come from investing in a company because you want to sell it in 2 years. Those come because something happens and you ride it for a long way and it becomes really big and really valuable. So, and the other thing is, so from that standpoint, it's not our objective from the beginning to have companies to sell. Secondly, if you build a company to sell, you usually fail. You have to build a company and build the team so it can be independent. And if you don't have that mindset from the beginning, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. Because even companies that are bought in a good situation are bought. They are not sold. That means somebody comes along and wants to buy your company. If you are not able to look them in the face and say, we don't want to be bought because we have a viable independent path to success, you're not likely to get a very attractive price for your company, even if that's the ultimate outcome. And lastly, I would just say from a personal standpoint, everybody in our firm, with few exceptions, comes from an entrepreneurial background, an operating background. And it's just not fun to spend all your time building up a successful company, to have it be sold, and then have the management team be taken apart inside of some other organization. So, I think, the reality is most companies do end up merging with some other company. I think that has a lot to do with, a much more rapid pace of innovation than existed in 1939, and, a globalized economy where things, technology has a short half-life and you have to oftentimes exploit it, and not all companies will, have the opportunity because of their starting point or their technology to become really big. So that's the reason I think you end up with a lot of mergers and acquisitions, and hopefully that's a good thing for everybody.
Gordon, would you, from your experience, want to say something about this?
I think at the outset of the relationship, everyone's objectives are congruent. You're at the early stages, like having parents raising a child. So when the child is born, you know exactly how you're both going to do it. But over time, it tends to change. The conditions is the company begins to build or develop over time. What I have found in my experience is upon occasion, the venture capitalist will have a different perspective than the management will. It's not to say it's right or it's wrong, but their portfolio may say that this is really a ripe time for an acquisition, to sell a company. And if we do have a significant position, the way many venture capital firms do, they're going to have enough votes to get it done. So there are cases of that. So I'm not trying to generalize. I also think that most venture capital firms have a lot of benefit besides simply being providing deep pockets of funding. I mean, if you have the right venture capitalist working with you, the value of that is very, very high.
Okay, so if I might try to summarize for a moment here, because I thought this was really very interesting discussion here. I think that what I heard you say, it's that being an entrepreneur and a CEO is not mutually exclusive, but it's unlikely. There are examples, but they are unlikely. And the second point, which I thought relates back to our question, which was is not puzzling, but I'm thinking about this, is to the extent that in fact the entrepreneur does a very good job in actually picking the people of the founding team, to what extent does that in fact potentially reduce the conflict or the intention, let's put it that way, between what the VCs will have to do and what the founding team really wants to do? Do you think that it helps, or it doesn't make much difference?
I want to unask the question, because I don't think it's a question of what the VCs have to do, or there has to be organizational changes. I think the question is the entrepreneur, is he or she self-aware enough to understand he or she's limitations? Yeah. And I would say 99.9% of people have some limitations. And when it comes to being a great entrepreneur, that person will usually have hit some kind of wall when it comes to running a big, successful company, if you get that far. So if that person's self-aware, there's usually a good solution for everybody. But if not, that's where the tension sometimes is created.
I think where we're missing is, what I'm saying is there are entrepreneurial CEOs and there are HP CEOs. There are people who are very effective running an early stage company and less effective maybe when the company gets huge. It's a different animal. I based my whole business for 33 years on the fact that there was a different person called entrepreneur and sort of senior manager at Procter & Gamble. And I think there's an entrepreneurial CEO, an entrepreneurial VP of marketing, an entrepreneurial VP of finance. And I think what I'm hearing people say when they say entrepreneur is sort of the techie guy who invented the product. And it just isn't what it is.
No. I don't think we heard you. Let me step in and say, I don't think that's what we heard you say. But I'd like to, for a moment, since there's many of the students here and others in the room who probably are thinking about that, starting a company, is there any burning question that one or two people, we can only have one or two because we want to move on, but a couple of burning questions. So let's go first here. I saw your hand up first. Yeah. Introduce yourself, please, and make sure everybody hears the question.
My name is John. I'm a student here at Stanford. I was just curious, with respect to the Hewlett-Packard type companies, I mean, those people put their own name on the company. It's pretty obvious they wanted to take it,
things can the founders do to make it more likely that their company will last a long time and not have the incentives for the venture capitalists to want to sell it after 5 years or 7 years or whatever?
No, again, I want to unask the question. Why would we ever want to sell a company if it was successful in public and the stock price was going up? I mean, why would we ever sell it? I mean, who would even have a right to sell it? I mean, I guess we never have control positions of any of the companies we're investing in. Never. We just don't. I mean, it's just not what we do. We're not interested in being control investors. There are guys out there, John Malone, every company he's ever in, well, I shouldn't ever, but most of the companies he wants to put his money in, he wants to have some level of control. I mean, usually voting control. We don't do that. So all I'm saying is that, first of all, I want to unask this notion of, I want to unask this question, is there a way to start up a company that the venture capitalists won't sell? It just doesn't work that way. Now, you asked something else, though, that was quite interesting. You say, how can I start a company that goes a long way? Hey, that's all about success and building, a long-term vision. I mean, when Bill Gates started that company, he started with C, not even. I mean, what was the basic? Do you think they even sell basic anymore? Nobody cares about basic anymore. The guy had no interest in languages. I mean, that was just a place to start. He saw, I want to start a company that writes software that goes on every PC. If you start too small, you'll never build a long-lasting company. You got to build a very big vision from the beginning. You got to start small. You got to start somewhere. It's got to be an entry point that makes economic sense. But you have to have a very big vision that's a big growth market opportunity, and you got to be willing to live in it for 20 or 30 years. That's the way to start a big, successful company. And there's guys out there right now doing that. You think Jeff Bezos expects to not be the CEO of Amazon.com 15 years from now? I guarantee you he does. And by the way, his name is not on the name of that company.
Let's see, one more question here.
Yeah, I have an answer for that. I think the key...
There's a lot of passion here in the room. We can feel it.
The key to the entrepreneur surviving is to really recognize his own strengths and his own weaknesses, and be willing to bring in people that are probably better than you in certain positions. So to build too many times the founding entrepreneur wants to be CEO, and the VCs will invest because they think you'll go somewhere else if they don't let you be CEO. But having a self-awareness, knowing what you're good at, knowing what you're not so good at, putting a group of people together is a survival strategy, I think, for anything. I think that goes a long way.
Please introduce yourself and speak so that everybody can hear.
Toy Matsumura. I'm a second-year MBA student here at Stanford. And I'm wondering, when you are really young and you're just you just graduated from business school, or you're just 1 year out or 2 years out and you want to start a company, you want to find a good team. You mentioned that you have to be able to sell your idea to get the right people, but what exactly is it in there to get more experienced people than you are? Because you know your limitations and you want to get people that have 10 years of experience, and I think it's kind of difficult to sell an idea.
This is a question that's coming up. This is a prepared question.
Yeah, good.
You can just, I don't know if you want to take it down. I forget which one it is, but
that's fine. I think why don't we do that?
One would be, I think you actually have two. One would be, should one recruit only those people who have prior experience in the particular industry, or one is about friends. Where was that?
Yeah, that's. Why don't you want to address that?
Which question is that one?
Yeah, why don't you want to address that one?
Yeah, which one is it?
Should one recruit people?
Oh yeah, prior experience in the industry. Yeah, I'll take a stab.
And it's actually more broad, because she really said more experienced people than you are yourself as a starting MBA.
People that have skills that you don't have.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at it. I'll take a stab at both of those. We'll flesh it in with much more detail, I'm sure. In terms of, first of all, in terms of hiring people with experience, clearly the probability of long-term corporate success is enhanced when there are employees who have some experience and understanding of what the market is, and hopefully of the technology that is going to be deployed in that market. However, the degree of experience that is requisite can vary a lot by industry. To me, at least in the companies that I have joined in very early stage, to me, the single most important hire was the VP of R&D, the visionary. That didn't have to be the VP of R&D. It could be, in one case, it was the CEO who was the visionary, but the person who had the perspective of what had to be done, and then also knew enough of what basic skills to get, and then their priority changed to assisting in the recruiting effort, to locating those people, to find them and get the base for future growth. After that visionary, my personal view is it's either if that visionary is the R&D person, the next person is the CEO is most important. Then it starts tailing off fairly quickly. The other question was, we'll handle it
Somebody
later.
else? Somebody else on the panel?
Well, I'm not sure if I can respond to what Gordon just said, because I think of it quite differently. I mean, see, entrepreneurs are kind of born, and they you know, it's hard to sort of say I'm going to go out and how do I get better at selling an idea. I mean, it's a combination of how good the idea is and how impassioned and convincing you are. And you know what? I've seen people who are junior to you get giants of the industry to sign up for their idea. Why? I don't know, because they were just very persuasive people and it was a very compelling idea. That's what entrepreneurship is about. So I guess what I would say is, you know, I don't think it's about getting your friends. I don't think it's about hiring an R&D person. I think it's about the combination of the chemistry of who you are and how you can attract people and how you can sell people and how good the idea is. And that's magic in a bottle. That's what we seek for every day. That's why I spend, you know, dozens of hours meeting with people who think they have it. You know, very few do, but I look for it.
So you say not everybody can be an entrepreneur then?
I think it's very hard.
Absolutely true. If you don't have the personality fit for it, you're not going to be successful in it.
You want to say something about that, Scott, from your experience?
I would reiterate. I think you guys are agreeing on something that may not come across that way, and so I'm going to try to maybe decipher it a little bit.
Good.
Thank you.
And that is this concept of the product visionary, which has to be, in some cases, is the entrepreneur, in some cases, is the partner of the entrepreneur.
Mm-hmm.
Correct.
But
right.
this is so essential. And I remember it came to me once. There was this very interesting company that I was spent all this time with the team, and I was, you know, really digging into the high caliber people in every position. The idea seemed at a high level really, really interesting. And I kept staying awake at night thinking there's something I can't figure out about this company. And so finally it dawned on me. There was no product visionary. They had a high-level architecture of what they wanted to do, but there was nobody in the company who really knew at a deep level what it was they were going to do, you know, all the way down the path, you know, from a technical standpoint and the merging of the technical and the market need. I walked away and they were ultimately unsuccessful, but it kind of crystallized it forever in my head, how important it is to have that person. And when somebody is that person, they have that idea and they have the ability to sell it to other people, that's the essence of entrepreneurship, which is I think what Russ was getting at. And you know, I don't know that everybody has that. It's hard. I mean, you know, part of being persuasive is being able to withstand a lot of people saying no, a lot of these people from the outside you were talking about who will say, you're crazy, you're crazy, you're crazy, and just saying, but being, you know, you have to be so knowledgeable that you know that these people don't know as much as you do about this problem, and you can convince the right people that you have the answer.
It's part of the reason that a lot of entrepreneurs come off as very cocky, right? And that cockiness turns on a certain kind of person that wants to hitch that ride, you know?
Yeah, they are different. There are people who make the ride from zero to billion-dollar company, but not many. They're the exception. There's subtle differences. Entrepreneurs generally have a higher sense of urgency than middle-top management in larger companies. The only thing they've got, the only advantage they have is speed and flexibility. So they have to be willing to make and like making decisions with less data, maybe a third the data that you'd get at Hewlett-Packard. It's a metabolism. It's like almost a personality trait. I think some people, if you want to survive from the entrepreneurial stage to the big company stage, you have to change who you are, how you manage. It's just a different ballgame. The emphasis is not on sort of big company management skills. The emphasis is on doing things, and making decisions and so forth. So a lot of sort of entrepreneurial CEOs are not necessarily wouldn't be successful, I think, in an HP. In fact, I found most entrepreneurs don't even like their own company when it gets big. All the things that made them do it makes them not like it anymore. So it's just there is a different person, I think.
Yeah, a couple of questions. Let's see. I think we had someone in the back there a long time. Yeah, yes, sir.
My name is Harry. I'm not from Stanford. However, this is a nice opportunity to ask a few questions. So this morning, and you mentioned in your opening introduction a couple of things, and the keynote speaker in the morning said a few things. I'm going to try to blend that and kind of pose a question to the panel here, maybe mostly like Tom and others also. The question that we heard this morning was that there's a lot of, in some of these companies, 22-year-olds come up with a lot of good ideas, but it's very difficult to scale that up to a larger, what is the growth path? And then then there's also, you brought up the issue of the network problem, that how do you hire the team when you are going to be looking inside a small space to look for other people, and how do you actually go find other people in the other industries who may have the similar types of skills to build a company that from the day one that is probably set up to scale up.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, that is very close to our third question, actually, right? Where should an entrepreneur look to find his team? What are the best sources to find talent, VCs, executive recruiters, personal network? Is it a good thing to bring friends into the company? I think we have partly already answered some of these questions, but maybe here we have the various sources of these where you can find team members. Maybe you want to speak to that. I thought maybe Gordon, would you like to say a few words about that?
I'll take a start. I mean, obviously, if you're looking to reduce risk, and when you're in an early phase of a startup company, you often tend to try to reduce risk. You may say the easiest way to do so early on is by working with people with whom I've worked before. That's fine if they know the industry. That's fine if they have the same culture. That's fine if you have shown the ability to work together very, very effectively. But I think most people can only do that so far. I don't think that scales very well. There comes a time when you're going to have to start looking to others outside to build a critical mass. And that can involve working with venture capitalists, working with executive recruiters, or just doing your own recruiting. Do you want me also to get into friends, or should we put that on?
Why don't you say something about that? Yeah.
Okay. I don't have an objection to bringing friends into the company. I do realize that it's a potential double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's less risk in many senses because you know the person well, you know you can work together, and so forth. The opposite side is you leave yourself open in some instances to being charged with nepotism. You know, if you brought in somebody at a high position who others see as, wow, I should have had that position, I'm better qualified. It reminds me of the time when John Kennedy became president. You know who he appointed as Attorney General? His brother, Robert. And I remember reading the press from the New York Times that said Robert should have been appointed only if every single qualified person in the U.S. had first turned it down. Well, I don't feel quite that strongly. The main issue to me is to make the decision as unbiased as possible. So for me, that's the CEO making that decision. And if he makes the decision to sacrifice the business benefit to pursuing his friendship, he could not do greater harm to the company. That would be an incredibly stupid mistake. The one thing that the brother, sibling, whoever, has to realize is they're held not to the same standard as every other employee, they're held to a higher standard. And the reason it's a higher standard is because they are automatically going to be perceived as others as getting favoritism. They have to execute at the very highest level.
the friend thing can be take another step. I think if an insecure manager has may have a tendency to want to hire loyalty over competence, and that's the real issue. The real issue is when you bring a friend, or is competence, right? It's not whether it's a friend or not. If you have an insecure manager, they will tend to surround themselves with security. Whereas a secure manager will pick someone who's better than they are, and feel good about it, feel like you make their job easier. I think the way that question started out had to do with sort of where do you look for people? Do you look at headhunters or VCs or network? And I don't think that's really the issue either. I think if you know who it is you want to hire for some job, CEO, VP of something, you do it. If you don't know who you want to hire, or you may think but you're not sure, then you want someone who's focusing a whole lot of time and energy on that problem. That may be you, that may be a headhunter, that may be a VC, but it isn't going to drop down your chimney. It isn't just going to happen. And so the issue is somebody needs to be working that problem. From my perspective, of course, the time of my living, it's the most important thing you'll ever do. It's just team. It's like a basketball team. It's 5 or 6 people, but it is absolutely the make or break it thing. You find the right. If you have the right business plan and the right product idea and the wrong people, it never works. The corollary is true. You can have the wrong business plan, the wrong product idea, and the right people, and the thing works because they don't run in the wrong direction very long. My biggest client ever started out in rugged mini computers and ended up developing the first computerized PBX system. They knew nothing about computerized PBX systems. They'd all come from aerospace defense kind of thing. So that it's a big deal.
Maybe we should get one or so, or maybe both persons here who kind of come from the venture side to say a few words about that.
I was going to reiterate this issue of loyalty over competence. I just think that is so incredibly important, and it's a mistake you see many, many times in a first-time CEO, entrepreneurial CEO, who legitimately has some concerns about how they will be treated and whether they will be able to ultimately be the CEO of the company or for how long. And so it's a common mistake to hire people who are going to be loyal to you rather than the very best people. And so whenever I get involved in a company with someone like that as the CEO, one of the things I tell them is I say the best way for you to keep your job the longest is to hire absolutely outstanding people in every one of the VP positions. And I gave that advice, interestingly enough, to a company I funded about 18 months ago now. And one of my questions at the time I funded this company was how long the CEO would be successful and be the right person for the company. As it turned out, last calendar year, this company missed its revenue projections pretty significantly. But the one thing this guy did better than anyone I can remember was he hired an unbelievable team of people. And that's the single reason why he has his job today, because he has this team of people, and I'm very confident they're going to be able to do what they need to do this year. Had he missed his plan and not hired that team of people, I would have fired him 4 or 5 months ago.
I can be brief. I would never recommend hiring friends into a company. I don't see the benefit of that. There's lots of places for people to work, and there's just so many pitfalls, and it gets so confusing. It's just a mistake. I think, all these questions about where do you find good people, they're everywhere. I mean, you can hire recruiters, and we do it all the time. Venture capitalists have great networks if they're any good. And of course, if you're a good entrepreneur, you have a good network. So look at all those places.
Yeah, good. I think, well, let's take 1 or 2 questions again. We haven't had one from that side, so let's go to, yes, sir.
My name is Bob Sisson. I'm MBA 74. This discussion is focused on building a management team. Now, if you're successful in getting the A team together, it's not going to be very long before everybody else in town recognizes it. And since everybody else wants to build an A team, you're the bullseye. Could you guys comment a little bit on retaining the A team that's proved itself?
I think that's what management's all about. I mean, part of your job is to make it a place they want to work and don't want to leave. And if they leave, it's not necessarily a reflection on you. It has to do that they view this as a better opportunity. But there's no way I think that you can keep somebody who doesn't want to be there.
Please, yeah.
Or wants to be somewhere else.
I guess I would say a couple things. I mean, there's certainly a number of economic incentives that you put in place, long-term stock options that vest, and so forth. But I think at the end of the day, if you really have highly motivated, successful people, they want to win. It's all about winning. If they're on a winning team and you point them at another place to win, I mean, usually you take a hill and you kind of get going. And things are humming. First of all, it doesn't always happen that way, but if it does, you're in good shape. Then the next question is, can you just keep humming along and somebody get picked off? Yeah, somebody will come pick off your best people. But if you put them at another hill, you point them at another place, and sometimes you give them slightly different challenges. Last time you climbed that hill by building the product. This time I'm also going to ask you to go out in the field a little bit more. Whatever. That's sort of management 101 kind of, mix and match, create different challenges. But I think it's all about getting them focused on the next hill. I mean, again, I think so much of this is about winning and creating the momentum to win. Even in companies that are just having a hard time, getting even past first base, you can put stock options on the table all day long, and it doesn't matter. You got to get that winning momentum going. I mean, you don't have to hit the grand slam, but you have to get that momentum going. You have to feel like a winning team. You have to have enough milestones that look like you're going good, and you have to point at something really interesting.
I think that's probably very, very accurate. Clearly, just using cash is not going to work, and it never works. I mean, it may postpone the decision for a very short period of time, but it won't do it. For an early stage company that is accomplishing things, options have a lot of leverage, because if you're early stage, enough people can envision a high ultimate potential value. But even then, to me, the core issue is developing the right culture from day one of honesty, integrity, and working together and teamwork and all of that stuff. You'll still find people who say, I think I can get this elsewhere, and if they pay me more, I'll do it. But on the other hand, it can work, I think, pretty effectively.
I'll give one more anecdote. How I know NVIDIA is a good company? I'm in a startup that recently tried to recruit a very senior technical person out of NVIDIA, and this guy was awesome. I mean, he had more patents than I could even dream of numbers. I mean, this guy was amazing. So we recruited him. He wanted to come, and when he told NVIDIA that he was leaving, what did they do? They increased his salary, blah blah blah. They gave him a new job, not a new title. Mm-hmm. They gave him a new job. Mm-hmm. He stayed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if I might say just one word on that, and then it's, to elaborate on that point, I won't mention the company, but once someone told me it's almost like being on a great sports team. Right? If you are a superstar player and you play with other superstars, then you can achieve fantastic things. If you are a superstar and you leave the superstar team and you're going to have to join the other team, you're going to have to work a lot harder and far more less likely to be achieving the same performance. So the chemistry, the genius is in really continuing to have these A players, I think, which everyone on this panel has been relating to. I just want to say a word about that very important point.
Yeah,
Scott?
I would just say two quick things. One is, in the technology business, I don't think there are that many great CEOs out there, so I don't think there are that many people who are capable of stealing you away if you do your job right. And I think the simplest thing about being a great CEO is treat people the way you'd want to be treated if you were on the team. And if you do that in all the different ways, people will stay.
Let's have one more, two questions here, and then I think we should have one final question here to bring it to a conclusion, because we are going to we have another 10 minutes roughly. Okay. So quick ones. Let's see. We have actually your hand has been up for. Have you already asked a question?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so because you had your hand up very early. Yes, keep going. Then we'll go to the gentleman with the yellow jacket. Yes, please.
I have a question on just how do you assess the effectiveness of the management team, especially in early stage venture capital, and especially if you're just on the board. What heuristics do you apply to tease out if the management team is being effective when the company's faltering, given all the other externalities that could be coming for like the market or the timing of the technology, or if the management team is being effective in spite of themselves because of other externalities? How do you tease that out?
This is a hard problem. And it's not just about early stage companies. It's, measurement in management is a very hard problem. I mean, they probably have a dozen courses here and none of them have the answer. All I can say is if the company's meeting its plan, it doesn't matter how screwed up the management team is, you don't change it. You just don't, because you don't want to mess with success. Now, if things are not working, then you go to the usual culprits. And I can't tell you that it's any correct or proper way to do it. But people have objectives, they have sales targets, and you look to those and you kind of find out what's going. Now, you also do the intangibles. You go to board meetings, you kind of see who's perking up, who's not, who's on top of what he or she's supposed to do and whatnot. But there's no magic to it. I'm sorry. I wish I do. If you have any magic about it, let me know.
It's just my way of looking at it, but I don't view the board's job is to assess the VPs, and that or so-called management team. Board hires, fires, pays a CEO, and if the team is not functioning correctly, their job is to take that up with the CEO. That's it. I think any monitoring a board does of VPs basically undermines CEO. And so if you got the right one, you stick with them. If you got the wrong one, you get another one. But you don't try to run the company at the VP level.
By the way, I totally agree. I didn't mean to say that. I mean, what happens usually is the CEO comes to the board and says, we've got a problem with the VP of sales. And then, everybody kind of looks around and says, do we or not? How do we know? I think that was kind of the question you're asking. And that's a hard question to know, because you didn't make your sales targets. Do you have a problem with the VP of sales? And 9 out of 10 times, you fire the VP of sales, and 9 out of 10 times, I don't know if we got a problem with the VP of sales. I don't know. It's a hard problem.
Yes, and it's going to be the last question that we want to ask in a moment. But since we promised him to hear this gentleman to ask a question, let's get him first. Yeah.
My name is Pete, and first of all, I want to say to Mr. Kelly, you brought me into the Bay Area 25 years ago, and I thank you.
You're welcome.
The question to the panel is, the focus has been on venture-funded companies and how you build teams. The fact is there isn't much venture funding these days. So for entrepreneurs who want to build a company with limited cash, I'd like your perspective on how you build a team with limited cash and how you get the attention of headhunters when you can't pay full fees. How can you help these entrepreneurs out here build a team on limited resources without venture funding?
I can tell you the headhunter part. I don't know the other, probably angels or something. But there are headhunters who will do searches for equity or for a small amount of cash in equity. We were one of them. The payoff, if the headhunter is good at figuring things out, is significantly more than the fee.
All right.
There's the other.
I don't know, Pete, if we answer. I mean, I guess I would say, look, you're a great entrepreneur, and I bet you can recruit people. Now, okay, so, but I guess what I'm speaking to, I mean, you're right. It's not easy to recruit great people out there, and if you don't have a great personal network, who do you look to? I don't think it's not as simple as recruiters won't take my role, because even if you could hire recruiters, you might still have the same issue of, who's this? What's this business? Why can't you get investment capital? So it's a bigger ball of wax. I mean, if the company has a good plan and it's a strong entrepreneur and it's a credible, backing, in other words, have enough money that you can pay a salary, then I think you actually could recruit people and you probably couldn't get headhunters. But if you don't have all those things in place, then yeah, you might struggle. But I think there's enough good people out there that'll join non-VC-backed companies. Sometimes those are the best companies. I mean, there's some company, Microsoft didn't need to take any venture business. I mean, it did. I mean, Marquardt, basically got some money in there. But, that company, I think if you talk to Bezos.
It's just a token.
No, Bezos was in the same position. I mean, he took money from venture capitals from Kleiner Perkins because he wanted help and stuff, but he didn't need to. So I think there's nothing wrong. Let me just say it flat out. There's nothing wrong with starting companies without venture-backed money. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I would applaud you all to bootstrap your companies. You're in the strongest position, and if you can do that, more power to you. I think it's awesome.
Another scenario that an example was there was a company called Comag years ago, and it was funded, I believe, Tony's son, and they gave the founder, Tu Chen, like $250,000 to write a business plan and find a CEO. And the real money wouldn't come until the CEO was found, and the CEO wouldn't come until the venture was found.
Until the money was there.
And so it's like an escrow closing, right? The CEO came, the money came, we got paid, everyone was happy. Yeah. But so there's all kinds of sort of creative ways that people can raise money and get people.
So I came to the Valley about 16 years ago, and I came to join a non-venture-backed startup, a bootstrap company, as the first VP or as the first salesman, really. And the thing that company did, which I think is a higher risk strategy than being able to just hire, your dream team, was they looked for really young people who were incredibly motivated and, pretty talented, but not necessarily good at what they had, not necessarily with any experience. And they didn't pay them anything, and they gave them a lot of stock. And I think I came here with a salary of $30,000 a year, and I had to rate. My job was to get enough revenue to pay half the staff every month. And that company worked. It ultimately went public. Venture capitalists came in and threw a bunch of money at it after it didn't really need any money. But it's one way to go.
And I think that on this very happy note, I think we should call it a day. Thank you very much for the panel.